for FUELS 2020 virtual. I'm John Eichberg with the Fuels Institute. And I'll be honest, I never thought I'd actually say these words, but I really wish I was in Dallas. It's been a challenging time for everybody, and I think we've all gotten pretty comfortable with the mobile remote sources. So we're going to try to use that this week. We've got 5 fantastic programs set up. Even though we're not together, we wanted to make sure we gave you some quality insights into where the transportation energy market is, what we've experienced the last couple months, and how it might affect how we go forward. But what we've really wanted to do is kind of get us focused on what comes next. Right now, we're all kind of enmeshed in what's going on around us currently, but we really need to be thinking about the future and getting prepared for the next step. So we've got, like I said, 5 great speakers over the next 2 days, and they'll be available on demand for you and your colleagues to view after this conference as well. A couple of housekeeping things first. This is the session of the Deloitte Global Automotive Survey. We're going to be joined by Ryan Robinson from Deloitte, and he's a veteran of the Fuels Institute, was with us in Denver a couple years ago. And we're going to be talking about what the consumers are thinking about regarding transportation energy. And they've been doing some new surveys recently to really get a capture of what consumers are feeling under the coronavirus pandemic situation and where things might be going after that. If you have any technical difficulties, please send a private chat to the Fuels Institute host. Donovan is on the call, and he can work with you to try to resolve any challenges you have. If you have any questions, use the Q&A feature, and I'll be filtering those at the end of Ryan's presentation to give him the questions that you've provided throughout the session. Each attendee is going to receive a link to the on-demand recordings on Friday, May 21st. So even if you're watching this, you'll get a link. If your colleagues have registered, they'll get a link to see the on-demand versions of these presentations, and they'll be available through Friday, June 5th. On June 5th, we're going to be sending out an email with attachment to the presentations that speakers have made available to us. If you get that email and there's a presentation that is not included, it's largely because the speakers asked us to not provide the presentation to you in advance. So with that, I'm going to introduce Ryan Robinson. If you want to show yourself, a little different image than your picture. I can't really talk too much. The official photo I use is from 2013. So my comment is I'm never going to get looking any better than that. So might as well hold on to what I've got, right?
Yeah, thanks, John. I don't know who that young guy is, but that was at least 100 years ago. It feels like. So,
yeah, we all kind of feel that way. So, with no further ado, guys, I'm going to turn it over to Ryan here. Real quick though, I looked at his presentation earlier today, and one of the things, Ryan, that I kind of caught from that is so much of the attention of the global automotive industry leading into 2020 was focused on this whole concept of autonomous, connected, electric, shared mobility. And so a lot of the stuff you're going to be showing focuses on that. And it's going to be interesting to see how after the pandemic and the change in behavior, which you guys are tracking as well, how those topics carry forward after we come out of the restart. So I'm not going to take any more time away from you. Please go and share your screen. And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ryan Robinson.
Great. Thanks very much, John. And thanks very much for the opportunity to address the audience today. I think it's a real testament to the agility of your team to put on this great content in a virtual environment. So hopefully you guys can see my screen now. I'm just going to make a couple of adjustments here. Okay. So as John said, what I'm going to do today over the next 35 minutes or so is give you a sense of where we were going into the pandemic. So this is results from our global automotive consumer study that we run every year. This is kind of a view of where we were, as I said, going into the beginning of the year. I think it's interesting for us to go through some of these results because it really sets us up for what we're going to talk about at the end of my talk, which is a brand new study that we launched just in the last 4 weeks, focused on where we go from here. So it's really trying to understand, to what extent the consumer is going to re-engage after this time of self-isolation with the automotive sector, and to what degree they're going to do that and how they're going to want to re-engage when that time comes for them. So it's a lot of content, true to form. I've brought a lot of material to show you today. I'm hoping that it's going to get through. I'm going to get through it in about 35 minutes. We're going to have hopefully then some time for Q&A. And if we can't answer any of your questions today, obviously we'll keep a parking lot open and answer them as we go forward as soon as we can. So obviously the Deloitte Global Automotive Consumer Survey, it's something that we've been doing for the last 10 years, really focused on trying to uncover the macro trends going on in the automotive sector. So here's kind of a view of what we knew prior to the pandemic. And this year's study really focused on those that CASE acronym, or those advanced technologies that John mentioned earlier. So connected, autonomous, shared, and electric. I know that we're going to save most of our comments for the electric space, but I wanted to kind of set the stage for in regards to these other advanced vehicle technologies, because I think it's really important to understand where we were and then what we think is going to happen coming out of this period that we find ourselves in at the moment. So what we knew going into even the beginning of this year was that global vehicle demand really had started to soften in a lot of markets around the world. We thought that it was definitely pointing to at least a cyclical downshift, if not more of a structural downshift in some markets, where demand was just going to kind of go down and stay down. We've been on a tremendous run for the last 10 years coming out of the Great Recession. And, this is all kind of the backdrop within which OEMs were pouring billions, tens of billions of dollars into these advanced technologies that we're going to run through for the next few minutes. So our survey results, are at least where connected vehicles technologies are coming from, really pointed to this idea of concerns about data privacy. And those, have remained kind of in the forefront as OEMs try to crack the code, not only to figure out how to work with the data that's being generated and disseminated from the operation of vehicles, but really it comes down to whether or not you can monetize any of that data. And, it comes down to, we think, an issue of trust, where the data that's being collected and disseminated, as I said, on the one hand, we're going to see some data that suggests that the stakeholder group that consumers most trust with that data is the OEMs. But you can look at it from, not to foreshadow my comments too much, but you can look at it from the perspective, from a positive perspective, kind of a glass half full, but you can also look at it from, I think, through the lens of a glass half empty approach too. And we're going to talk through that as we get to it in a few minutes. Before we do that, though, just a summary comment on autonomous vehicles. This, and again, this is where we were going into this year. So we've been talking about this for actually a couple of years. We launched this study at CES in Las Vegas every year in early January. And if you were like me, an attendee of that particular event over the last couple of years, you've seen a real shift in the tone and messaging around autonomous vehicles. 3 years ago, it was the core messaging was, get ready, buckle up. These things are around the corner. We're going to have, significant fleets in urban markets around North America and indeed elsewhere in the world by the end of the year, kind of thing, within a 12-month time frame. Now, since then, we've started seeing that kind of pull back and pull back and pull back until where we're at right now. I'll get to that in a second, but the results from this year's Global Automotive Consumer Study suggest that, in a lot of markets, we've been seeing a stalling of interest in autonomous vehicle technology. There was, a lot of interest, and we'll get to some of the metrics that we point to that allow us to kind of formulate that opinion. But there was a lot of interest in the 2017, 2018 timeframe, and then it really started to stall. And that really hasn't changed at all. And in fact, you look at a couple of markets like China and India are actually moving back in the wrong direction in terms of interest in AVs. which is very interesting, and we'll talk more about that in a minute or two. Shared technology, it really is a story around the fact that it's going to take a lot to change consumer perceptions and indeed consumer behaviors around multimodal mobility. So particularly in what you might call very developed markets like Japan, Germany, US, they're amongst the hardest groups of consumers to change or to shift in terms of their behavior. And one of the metrics that we use to describe that is, whether or not people are using multiple modes of transportation in a single trip. And in particularly those three markets, it's less than 20% of people that are telling us that they actually, are making that part of their daily transportation and mobility routine. So very difficult, I think, to kind of shift behavior on that front. And then finally, where we're going to spend most of our time, probably the topic most germane to the participants today is the interest in EVs. And I think that's, if you look at the four buckets of advanced technology that are presented on the screen, electric vehicles for a variety of different reasons, electrification, I should say, is probably a better way to put it, because we're going to make the distinction between full BEVs and the hybrid environment. But I think for a variety of reasons, this is the area of technology that has the most legs to really continue moving forward. A lot of these other technologies, particularly autonomous technology, there's some very significant question marks and concerns around whether or not the OEs and the supply base have the wherewithal to continue to the extent that they were piling money into R&D programs to make these technologies a reality. And then at the end of the day, you have to think about the consumer and whether or not they're going to pay for any of this technology. So what you're looking at is across the kind of six most I guess important from a size of market perspective, from an automotive standpoint. These are the markets that we tend to focus on around the world. And what you're looking at is the percentage of consumers within each of those markets that are not willing to pay more than the equivalent of around $500 US to gain access to these buckets of technology, whether it's safety or connectivity, infotainment or autonomy, or indeed alternative engine solutions. And the numbers are quite significant. So they're, the story that we were creating for the past couple of years is, that it's a question of whether or not there is going to be a return on invested capital for all of the billions of dollars that were being piled into these technologies to make them a reality in the first place. There is a little glimmer of hope, though, or at least there was, in the January-February timeframe when we released this study, where if you look at the percentage of people in each of these markets that were unwilling to pay anything more for gaining access to both autonomous technology and alternative engine technologies, from 2017 to 2020, the percentage of people that were unwilling is actually declined. So the inverse of that is obviously, the idea that, more people are willing to pay something to gain access to particularly these two technologies, or at least they were in the January-February timeframe. So now, what do consumers think about connected vehicles? The short story around connected vehicles is the fact that consumers around the world, you can see the six markets here, they're really split on whether or not they think that connectivity or increased vehicle connectivity is going to be beneficial. In India and China, there is, upwards of 8 out of 10 people that we surveyed that think that are very positive around the benefits of connectivity. But then you move down the scale to where we are in the US and indeed in Germany as a proxy for the European consumer, much less in terms of, the consumer's, perceptions of the benefits of vehicle connectivity. One of the reasons for that, I think, is the types of information that is starting to be drawn out from the operation of the vehicle. It's not just, vehicle location data and the how fast the car is going and, the braking and the operation of the vehicle, but it's also biometric data that's starting to be drawn out of the sensorization of the cockpit of the vehicle. And you can see that, even while India, as you remember from the last slide, was very positive on the benefits of connectivity overall, the Indian consumer is telling us that they are, very concerned about some of the types of information that's going to be drawn out or is being drawn out of connected vehicles. And you can see how that also pans out across the rest of the countries. In the US, it's about 6 out of 10 consumers, as we see here, middle of the pack. People are also concerned about the type of entity. So this goes back to the idea of trust in order to manage the data that's being generated and shared by a connected car. So as I said, it's kind of a glass half full, glass half empty approach or story where on the one hand, it seems like the one constituency or stakeholder group that pulls out of the rest is the OEM. But on the other side of the coin, there is a good number of people that would say, I would much prefer, I would much trust anybody other than the OEM to manage the connected vehicle data that I'm sharing. And to I guess a differing amount depending on where you are around the world, there are these other constituency groups. So in the US, for example, there is an identical percentage of American consumers that say they don't want anybody managing, or they wouldn't trust anybody managing the connected vehicle data that's being generated by their car. So a lot of issues around trust still have to be worked out relative to getting to a point where we can effectively use connected car data and monetize at the end of the day. So what do consumers think about autonomous technology? And as I said, I foreshadowed this a little bit in my opening remarks, but you can see how, over the last few study years, we've really leveled off in terms of the percentage of people that agree that autonomous vehicles are not going to be safe. So it's a little bit of an inverse way of thinking about this, but the larger the percentage, the more people within that individual jurisdiction don't think that that autonomous vehicles are going to be safe. So lower numbers are better, but in fact we see over time that the trend has actually been to level off for the most part. You've got a little bit of anomaly in South Korea, where the consumers continue to kind of think that, or kind of warm to the idea of autonomous technology, but you're still looking at roughly half of the consumer population, or at least the driving age population, that doesn't think that autonomous technology is going to be safe. And in fact, as I said, China was the most bullish on the technology, but you can see that as we move into this year's study results, along with India, that there is a reversing of that trend happening, which should be a little bit concerning, I think, for the forward prospects, or at least the timeline that we think we're on to be able to get to autonomous vehicle technology in the future. Part of that problem is and as we've been reporting over the past number of years, there is an echo chamber that gets created around some of the media reports of accidents involving autonomous vehicles that frankly have a very significant negative impact on consumers' perceptions of the technology overall. And one of the reasons, or one of the areas I think that would give consumers, or one of the factors, I guess, that would give consumers a sense of greater confidence in AV technology overall, is whether or not the government can, or this technology can be quote unquote government certified. And you can see India, China, Korea, all significant proportion of the consumers in those markets are looking to the government to get in the game in terms of establishing stable and standardized certification programs. And that we're seeing some signs of that, but we're just not seeing that in any great degree going forward. And particularly now, in the environment that we find ourselves in, the question really has to come around to whether or not governments, this is going to be very high on governments' to-do lists. And one of the last things I'm going to talk about in terms of AV technology is just the percentage of consumers that would most trust. So now we're back to this idea of trust, not on connected vehicles, but now on AV technology as a whole, and who consumers would most trust to bring AV technology to market. And one of the things that I wanted to bring to show you today is just the relative erosion in some markets around the world of trust as it's focused on the what you might call the traditional automaker market. So as we've seen over the last couple of years, new entrants to the market, or indeed, established technology players really pushing into the AV technology market. There is a bit of an erosion, particularly here in the U.S., of the percentage of consumers that would most trust the traditional automaker, as opposed to some of these other players around, who they would most trust to bring autonomous vehicle technology to market. And a couple of comments around, consumers and the new mobility models that are being developed. So this is the shared mobility space. One of the most interesting things, and this is going to come up, it's a direct linkage to the brand new material and data that I'm going to show you in a minute. But if you ask consumers, regardless of the country you're looking at, what's the best way to reduce traffic congestion, by far, in most markets around the world, the answer is greater access to mass transit as the best way to reduce primarily urban traffic congestion. Now, this, I don't have to foreshadow these comments too much, but we're going to see in a minute just how that issue has changed with social distancing and some of the concerns that consumers have around the health aspects of continuing to use mass transit. This is the story that I mentioned up front, where depending on where you are around the world, it is going to be, or it has been, very difficult in terms of changing consumer behavior relative to using multiple modes of transportation in the same trip. So we asked in these markets, and in fact all the markets that were covered in the study, a very simple question: how often do you use multiple modes of transportation in the same trip? So this is the example of using a commuter train to get to a subway connection, and then perhaps using a more green type of vehicle, whether it's a scooter or a bicycle, or even walking to get to your destination. Perhaps it's your daily commute. And in fact, there's a large percentage in places like here in the U.S. and Germany where people never do that. But the point of the story is this middle bar here, where it's only really a rare occasion for 50+% of the people that we surveyed in any of these markets around the world. So we think there's a lot of work to be done there still to really kind of cement the behavior amongst consumers that they're willing to think about alternative modes of transportation going forward. And then just I guess the poster child for shared services, shared mobility services, and ride hailing, I wanted to show you, just because we've chosen this metric to be more of a longitudinal data point for us from 2017 to 2020, where we are now, just the frequency of usage amongst ride hailing services. And you can see a couple of things pull out of this data set. One, the percentage of people who tell us that they're using it on a more frequent basis, so this is at least once per week, has actually gone down. In some cases, it's actually half of what it was in 2017, as kind of the halo of a brand new type of mobility service is kind of worn off. And in fact, we're starting to see, ride hailing just kind of, or it has been at least until now, kind of integrated in along with other, more traditional types of mobility options, taxi fleets, and so on. And you can see, we'll have another kind of direct linkage for where we are at the moment with consumers, concerns about ride hailing in particular. Having said that, we do see, especially amongst younger consumers, there is a propensity to think about whether or not they actually need to own a vehicle if they're already using services like ride hailing to satisfy their transportation requirements. And then finally, EV technology. This is, as I said, there have been some large decisions made by a number of different manufacturers. If you look at some of the powertrain decisions to move into the electrification space, these are large decisions. They are long-term decisions that are very difficult to unwind. So the big bets that some of these OEMs are making on an electrified future really is the kind of advanced technology that we think has the most legs in order to kind of continue along. Perhaps maybe not the momentum that we saw kind of prior to the pandemic that we're in right now, but certainly I don't think it's one of these things that is going to dry up. Certainly not like some of the other technologies that we see being perhaps shelved for the near term. Here you can see in the U.S., even in the U.S. where for a number of years we saw a concern or a reticence to move away from the gas diesel culture that has been created over the past number of decades. Even here you can see in 2019 the 29% is basically anything other than an internal combustion engine, and the percentage of people that would most want an alternative powertrain has jumped from in their next vehicle. So we're not talking about 10, 15, 20 years down the road. This is a consumer's near to medium term opinion. The percentage of consumers who want an alternative powertrain in their next vehicle has jumped from 29 to 41% just on a year-over-year basis, and that's very consistent as we've seen in terms of momentum in a lot of the other countries that are covered in our study. One of the main reasons for consumers to think about not just electrification as an alternative for them, but moving directly into the full battery electric vehicle market, obviously lower emissions, lower operating costs, and to a lesser degree, the tax rebates that a lot of jurisdictions are having to continue to place on them in order to maintain kind of forward momentum in terms of demand. The minimum driving range for a full electric vehicle, I thought I would throw this in there just to kind of orient you around, where consumers' heads are at. And basically the story is, even though, if you look at the average consumer's daily transportation requirements, so we measure that just by basically asking on average, how far do you drive each day? And this is in miles. You have a bit of a disconnect in terms of, and we know this from a variety of different areas of research that have been done over the years, but the short story is that there's still a large disconnect between what people are actually going to be using a BEV for in terms of number of miles that they're looking to gain out of that asset, and what their expectations are. So in Germany, for example, a third of consumers are still, expecting a minimum driving range of 400 miles for their full battery electric vehicle. To a lesser extent in the U.S. and so on down the line, but still a lot, like multiples of where their actual daily requirements lie. One of the more surprising things that came out of the global consumer study was just the fact that there is a significant proportion of people that are recognizing, and I think this is a reflection of people recognizing the fact that they are largely going to be using their full battery electric vehicle like they would a smartphone. So they would be largely, recharging these vehicles overnight. That comes through in these numbers, which suggests that there is a significant number of people that are willing to wait, at least 30 minutes to fully charge a BEV. We put in this less than 10-minute category because the assumption was that, as there was a disconnect between, people's reality and expectations regarding driving range, they would have the same kind of disconnect here. But, we would have expected these percentages to be, significantly higher than what we see here in terms of the number of people that are expecting, less than 10-minute full battery charges. And then finally, consumers across markets, we're looking at the couple of things that are going to be required if we're going to get to a full battery electric future. And one of those things is a national recharging infrastructure. And this is, we asked consumers, we thought it would be interesting to ask consumers who they thought would be primarily responsible for building that publicly accessible EV charging infrastructure. And you can see by and large, it's a question of either the vehicle manufacturers or the different levels of government running through each of these jurisdictions. To a lesser extent, depending on where you are around the world, to a lesser extent, it is the existing fuel companies, which would be very interesting, I would imagine, for people in this audience. To a lesser extent, the existing electric utilities, and then other types of stakeholders that would be involved in that conversation. So that's where we were, and I want to spend just a couple of minutes before we open it up to Q&A on where we are now. So just in the past 4 weeks, we launched a global study. It doesn't have quite the coverage, but it's pretty close and growing, I should say, of the number of countries involved in this new study that we are fielding every 2 weeks in 13 countries. It's now up to 15 countries. We just closed field and have starting to look at wave 3 of the data. Which is going to be available to everybody, I guess, on this call, and I'll get to how you access this information going forward and at the end of the discussion. But for the purposes of today's conversation, we have 13 countries covered. We have 2 waves to show you. One was we started this in the middle of April timeframe. We have an end of April timeframe to show you for comparison purposes. It's an online panel. Everybody, we target consumers that are at least 18 years of age. We translated all of these into local countries where it was appropriate to do so, and the target is around about 1,000. We're targeting about 1,000 responses per country per wave. And what we're finding, and this is kind of a very current, very hot off the press kind of view of where the consumer is at. It's a cross-sector approach we took, so it's not just automotive and mobility. It's consumer opinions around travel and hospitality. It's also looking at a number of different areas of the overall larger retail environment in general. And one of the things we asked them is a couple of questions on how concerned they are with the health of both themselves and their immediate sphere of influence, if you will, the loved ones, friends, and so on. And then a couple of questions about where they are in terms of financial concerns, both in the near term. So whether or not they are concerned about making upcoming payments, for example. This is very interesting and germane considering the unemployment data, that just the unprecedented amount of unemployment benefit applications we've seen in not just the US, but other countries around the world. And then from a longer term perspective, so delaying large purchases that they otherwise would have made. That is going to become very important as we talk about it in the particular automotive mobility context in a minute or so. Before we get there, though, just this shows you kind of the full breadth of the categories and baskets of goods that we're tracking in terms of spending over time. And what you're looking at is it's a calculation of net spending intent, where we ask the question, how much do you plan to spend on each of the following items over the next 4-week period versus the last 4-week period? And we take the people who told us that they're going to spend at least a little more or a lot more as a group, and then we take that and we minus the group of people that told us that they were going to spend either less or a lot less to get to this net outcome. And you can see across all 13 countries, at least in this wave 2 version of the study, where people's heads are at in terms of net spending relative to these individual categories. We group them together into roughly, less discretionary items versus more discretionary items. So it's the difference between, groceries and utilities versus, electronics and entertainment and furnishings, for example. And one of the things that you can tell from the heat map right away is, as you might imagine, people are shying away from the more discretionary items to put emphasis on the less discretionary items as a way to, essentially stock up on what they need in terms of weathering this storm that we're all in. And now we come to the last few slides that I have to show you today. So this is the particular automotive and mobility questions that we asked, that we continue to ask in this biweekly study that is going to be running hopefully at least until the end of the year. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't 100% COVID related, that it had legs to live on past the environment as we find ourselves in right now. And the reason we're doing that is obviously to get a real gauge on, what are some of the signposts, when are some of the inflection points that we're going to see in consumer behavior as we move through the different stages of hopefully opening up and staying up. But there is, that specter of a resurgence and potential resurgence in the pandemic getting into the fall timeframe, as we've all seen in the headlines. So, the first question that we ask is, from an automotive standpoint, to what extent are people delaying a planned vehicle purchase? So the way we asked that was, in terms of a percentage on an agreement scale of consumers planning to keep their current vehicle longer than they were originally expecting. And as you can see, across many of the countries that we're studying at the moment, with the exception of a couple of anomalies towards the right-hand side of this chart, to some extent Germany, to a larger extent the Netherlands, consumers by and large, at least half of them, upwards of half of them, are telling us that they are actually, agree with that statement, that they are planning to keep their current vehicle longer than they were expecting to. And it's I think it's a twofold right now. It has been up until this point. It's a twofold levels of concern where there is obviously a health component. People don't want to be going to the dealerships, and in fact, there was a period of time when you actually couldn't do that with some of the lockdown measures that were put in place across some of these geographies. But then, as we start to transition from, primarily health concerns to a situation where we've got more financial concerns moving in, related to, as I said earlier, some of these unemployment numbers, certainly, the financial pressure that's being placed on the general population in most of these countries is fairly severe. And we think that is going to be, a significant challenge for some of the, or at least all of the OEMs that are looking to kickstart demand coming off a trough like we've never seen before in the kind of March and April timeframe. So having said that, there is, at least some cautious optimism. I understand that, 2 data points don't make a trend, but there is some cautious optimism in places like China, as you can see, France, and in fact Germany, where we may be seeing a peak in terms of consumers that are thinking along these lines. And as the hope is anyway, that as we start to see more positive signs of being able to open these economies back up, that this percentage will start to recede somewhat. Just in the interest of time, as I said, it's not just the long-term kind of larger ticket purchase items that people are starting to put off. It's also, there is a smaller but still significant percentage of people that are that are looking to put off regular maintenance that they had planned for their vehicle. And again, it's got something to do with the health concerns around being in that dealership environment at the moment, but it's also, I think, a reflection of some of the financial pressures that are starting to creep into the equation. We also asked, we're reflecting to some degree on whether or not some of the behaviors that are being that consumers are adapting themselves to in this period of self-isolation, where there's been a huge uptick across a number of different categories, and even you might throw in that overused term, the new norm of buying things online and having them delivered, whether or not that's going to translate into larger ticket items like vehicles. So we asked consumers, if it was available, would you buy your next vehicle online? And frankly, we thought that these numbers, with the exception of places like India and China and to some degree Germany, as you can see, but we thought that these numbers were going to be a little bit higher given just the amount of online purchasing and delivery that's going on. I think it might be a reflection, obviously, of just the lack of it being available in some of these markets, and consumers are reflecting that. At least the responses are. But this is going to be a tremendously important metric, I think, to track over time, to see if consumers are willing to re-engage with the automotive market in terms of vehicle purchasing behavior. How those transactions are going to be accomplished is going to be very interesting to see develop over the next several months. And then, the idea of owning a vehicle, this is the interplay, as I said off the top, between, on the one hand, the percentage of people, large percentage of people that we're tracking that really value the idea of owning a vehicle, right? This is a reflection of obviously being able to control the self-isolation and personal distancing that people need to do, rather than looking at, satisfying their transportation requirements through things like public transit. This is the percentage of people that over the next 3 months are actively planning to limit their use of public transit. Obviously, we don't have a baseline before the pandemic because it just happened so quickly. But I think, when I look at these numbers, if we're looking at upwards of 6 out of 10, 2/3 of consumers across a variety of different markets that are planning to limit their use of public transit over the next 3 months, that's a pretty concerning number for, what everybody, as you recall, was the one single, the best way of combating urban vehicle congestion was greater access to mass transit. These numbers would suggest that that's going to be, maybe a little bit more challenging than people would think about at the moment. And then, to finally, look at ride-hailing services, obviously to a lesser extent than we saw here in public transit, but still, some question marks, and certainly I think it's going to be, fairly challenging for this ride-hailing service market to reassert itself as a viable transportation alternative, because you look at the health concerns. Sure, you're able to a certain degree kind of self-isolate and maintain that personal distancing, but you're still using a shared resource, and that's really weighing quite heavily on consumers' minds at the moment. So in conclusion, we look at first of all, thank you for your time today. I invite any questions that you have at the moment. I will just say that there is a couple of resources that will be available to you. One, we have a dashboard where all of the current biweekly results are getting loaded. The link is here for when you get this material after the surveys conclude, or the conference is concluded. And then obviously we have a variety of different assets of thought leadership around all of these macro trends that impact the global automotive sector that you can peruse at your leisure. So perhaps maybe I'll turn it back over to John for Q&A.
Thanks, Ryan. If you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen here, we'll get into the Q&A. We've got several come up. I'm going to try to bucket them a little bit because some of them are similar, and we'll
Sure.
try to get through as many as we can. A couple of them came up, and it was really asking how can you track, or do you track, the relationship between stated behavior, stated intended behavior, and actual behavior? And that relates to comment that mass transit is viewed by many as being one of the solutions, but how many people really use mass transit? They say
Right.
they want to use it, do they? EVs, the intent to purchase an alternative fuel vehicle, alternative, versus the actual purchase of them. And that reflects in some of your later data about the concern about using mass transit or ride-hailing services. Any commentary on anything you get to on that respect?
Sure, and this is, it's an age-old question, right? Around, do people actually do what they say they're going to do? And there are a variety of ways that you can exert, influence over what people actually do. We know that there's a variety of different ways that over many years, the automotive industry has influenced people's behavior with things like incentives. I can imagine that there are some OEMs out there that would want to incent the consumers into a decision where they would maintain a connection with internal combustion engines, for example, right? I mean, there's a variety of ways you can do that. What we track, what you can do is, particularly with the biweekly results that we're starting to gain right now, is start to match them up with what we're seeing from things like, headline analysis, policy analysis, and a variety of different jurisdictions that we track to get a very close kind of view of, we see consumers wanting to do this, and we see them reacting to some of the policies and incentives that are being put into the marketplace in a very real-time way. I think that if we look at public transit, for example, there are going to be a variety of people, because of economic means or some other influencer. They have no choice. They have to go back and think about using public transit as a primary mobility mode. But I think that tracking what people want to do gives you a very good indication as to where kind of overall trends might head, maybe not in the near term, but perhaps over time as well.
Well, I'll comment on that too, because we've did some surveys about, would consumers for the next vehicle be interested in buying a hybrid? And then we compare it to the actual number of vehicles sold that were hybrids. And the trends are consistent. When the interest in hybrids declined, sales declined. When interest went up, sales went up. Now, you're looking at a 48%, yeah, I'd like to buy one, compared to a 2%, yes, I actually bought one. But the trends are indicative of that. So I agree with you on that. On autonomous vehicles, there's a couple questions. One is, have you guys done any analysis of where insurance companies are with regards to autonomous transportation?
It's funny. I think that there's a lot of work being done. There's a lot of strategic analysis being done to think about how insurance will play out in autonomous vehicles. On the one hand, you have that ethical question that just isn't going away, because frankly nobody's got a good answer to it. Do you leave it over to the technology to choose what kind of accident they're going to have? On the other side, there is quite a positive in that the biggest positive coming out of autonomous technology is the reduction of collisions, right, and the reduction of the loss of life issue. So if we can move in that direction, I think it's insurance companies have got still a lot of question marks around how they operate within this environment, because you could say, yes, increased safety that technology is providing, very good. But on the other hand, if that means that people aren't or have less need for insurance overall, going to be a big challenge for insurance companies going forward, I think.
And a related question is for mobility as a service as a concept. I think you used CASE as your kind of acronym. There's like 5 or 6 acronyms for it: TASK, MAS, CASE. The question specifically is on, have you done the evaluation on the benefits to energy and environmental sector of mobility as a service? And I would add to that, with what we've experienced, what you're seeing trends, do you see some of the air being sucked out of that market as a potential mobility option for consumers going forward?
I think certainly the way it's kind of like it's a bit of a perfect storm that hit in terms of the pandemic and when it hit, because mobility as a service was kind of, still working out a lot of big questions in terms of gaining a large foothold and being a real viable option for a good number of people. And I think that there was a lot of things that were getting conflated there with, mobility as a service, with, even autonomous technology. And now we're in a situation where, it's still, like I said, a shared resource. So, consumers are in a position now where they're in a position where they don't know, or they're not comfortable with the hygiene or the cleanliness of that resource, and what's happened before they enter into that equation. So I think it's going to be there's some very significant concerns around where mobility as a service moves from here, because we haven't gotten to the point where we could make that service completely your own, or being able to get around some of the health issues that have been kind of thrust upon us over the last couple of months.
Recently, so you had some data in there regarding the pace of electrification, people's interest in going to alternative powertrains, stuff like that. And I know you guys don't do a whole lot of forecasting, at least not in the documents you've shared today. But a question was related to a headline I saw as well, that pickup truck sales continue to be pretty strong even during the pandemic. And it seems like inventory of pickups are starting to worry the OEMs, because they're going, whoa, we kept selling those, we stopped selling sedans, but we kept buying the trucks, and now we don't have enough to keep us going for the year. We got to crank up production. So the question is, do you have any comments on how that dynamic of the last 60, 90 days might reflect against some of the data and perceptions of the consumers that you guys are tracking?
I think it comes down to, when people are ready to re-engage with the automotive market, where are their heads going to be at in terms of what they need and what they're able to afford. I think that, there's still a large question mark, at least in my mind, in terms of the types of vehicles that are being sold in the kind of longer term. I think that there's there is a percentage of consumers that required certain vehicles, certainly large pickups. So there is some pent-up demand being created there. But overall, how much pent-up demand is just evaporating because of some of the financial pressures that we're starting to see creep into the consumer experience. So what does that mean? It means either people are going to be kind of reversing trend a little bit in terms of the type of vehicle, perhaps moving, snapping back from the juggernaut trend towards light trucks and particularly SUVs, perhaps to the smaller end of the segment, or perhaps it means looking at vehicles that are less well optioned than they otherwise would have been. So and this goes back to the comments on how much advanced technology is going to be putting into these vehicles, at least in the near term, and how much has that kind of runway been pushed out, if you will, right? Just because people can't afford it, right? So if you're putting all of that technology in a vehicle and you're not getting the return on investment for it, that's a problem for me, right? And I think it's going to be a problem for a lot of automakers.
I'm going to ask one more question about mass transit and multimodal travel. Then I'm going to turn to electric vehicle questions. So one of the questions was, what cities did you survey? But I think the bigger question would be, are you seeing a difference of consumer opinion, you crosstabs in your data for the acceptance of mass transit in various metropolitan areas versus other regions? And then the other question related is, in the definition of multimodal, are you tracking whether multimodal is just driving or walking to a train station, or is it multiple series of transportation modes incorporated in that?
Right. So to answer your first question, we haven't done the analysis yet on individual cities. And in fact, the way that we designed the survey, it wasn't meant to be able to get down to individual urban markets with only, 1,000 responses per country per wave. We're designing it to be kind of, at a national level, if you will. We have done some analysis by amping up the sample just within the U.S. To get at questions like, in the different phases of opening up the economy. We did an analysis that said, well, if you're in a county where it was essentially closed off versus starting to open up versus never having really been closed in the first place, does that really affect consumer opinions in terms of the level of safety and their behavior going forward? And that analysis, we're just starting to get into the meat of that analysis to understand what that's about. So the short answer is we didn't by design try to get down to the urban environment, the different urban environments. And the other question that you had was to do with
multimodal. So is it
multimodal.
just walking or driving to a train station, or is there other elements involved?
Yeah, we tried to give the respondent a good understanding, or at least an understanding of through kind of examples that we would include in parentheses of what that multimodality might include, right? So it might include things like, as I said, commuter trains, subways, micro mobility options. It could be a variety of different things. So I guess the answer to that question is it incorporated a broad kind of understanding of what multimodality mobility might be.
Now shifting to EVs, kind of almost out of time here, but let's talk about a little bit EV charging infrastructure. So I think a lot of the surveys I've seen, I think in some of your data, that's one of the hurdles to consumers feeling comfortable purchasing an electric vehicle. In the various work you guys do, how do you envision the charging infrastructure developing in terms of who owns it, what type of deployment are we looking at, and that type of stuff?
Well, even before we got into the pandemic environment that we're in right now, there was a huge question mark in terms of, who has the wherewithal in terms of putting the investment in place from a holistic standpoint to be able to build out a charging infrastructure that would be required in a market like the US to really start to change consumer opinions on that front. And, where we were kind of in the January timeframe was, given that there is, a variety of different stakeholders that would benefit from thinking about, having a piece of that future, and the consumer data that you just saw, where it's either the OEs that are providing the end user electric vehicle technology, or it's the government, or it's the existing fuel companies. So I think those three are kind of like the largest stakeholders in building that infrastructure. Whether or not the OEs have said, and there have been actual headlines on this, there have been OE executives that have said, we're not in the business of selling fuel, whether it's fossil fuel or electric fuel or otherwise. So the propensity for them to be the sole stakeholder of building out that infrastructure, probably not. Governments, particularly now, I don't think it's necessarily, I wouldn't imagine it would be necessarily on their very high on their to-do list in order to make that kind of investment available, considering all of the relief packages and all of the spending that's been going on just to keep everything afloat. The existing fuel companies probably have a large, part to play in this, particularly because they've got the locations that would make sense. I mean, from a fossil fuel infrastructure standpoint, it's all there, right? So there is an argument to be made that, you know, the refueling infrastructure in terms of location doesn't have to change. It's more of a change in technology. And I think that if the road that we were going down was one of a public-private partnership, where there might be an opportunity in some markets around the world where both public entities and private stakeholders could come together to really understand, you know, what does that infrastructure need to look like.
And then the final question before we let you go relates to the methodology. So when you ask consumers in your surveys about their thoughts on electric vehicles or infrastructure and charge time and all those things, are you pre-filtering those who are interested in EVs, who already have EVs, or is it just a general question to everybody you're asking?
It depends. So in some cases, we want to know from the entire audience, and we do try to you know, design our samples so they are kind of a general population. So there are in our samples people who do own vehicles, people who don't own vehicles, and depending on the question you want to get. I mean, obviously there is some skip patterning where, you know, if you ask people, you know, what kind of vehicle they own, how long have they owned it, you know, stuff like that. Not really, you know, relevant for people who don't own vehicles, obviously. But in terms of more the idea of say electric vehicles in general, that might be a question that you would want to have kind of a you know, as broad a base of understanding as you can create. So it really depends on the question, but we do take both approaches.
Well, Ryan, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate you sharing the insights and the knowledge that Deloitte's been capturing over the years. It's been fantastic for me. I use it all the time. So I encourage everybody to visit the Deloitte website, take a look at the reports they have and the surveys they have. There was a question posed about telecommuting. I'm going to defer that to the 1 o'clock session. We have Ricardo Consulting joining us. They're doing work right now for the Fuels Institute, looking at various transportation initiatives for their impact on emissions and economics. One of the things we're going to talk about today is the impact of possible telecommuting on the market. So check in for that. That's 1 o'clock Eastern time today. So that's about 57 minutes. And again, these are all going to be available on demand for you guys at the end of this week. And appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you in 1 hour. Thank you guys. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Yes, sir.
Thanks, Ryan.